The market hung in space like a bright wound. Ships from many worlds tied to long cables. Stalls floated on rings and plates. Traders shouted in different voices. Bright signs blinked prices in many tongues. People came to buy what they needed and sell what they could spare. For years the market followed rules. The empire's rules were oldest. Those rules kept trade in neat lines. They kept power safe. Hannah moved through the crowd with a small case. She was human and small among tall traders, but she moved with quiet strength. She did not wear armor or a badge. She wore a plain coat and a calm smile. In her case she carried papers and a plan. She had studied ledgers and promises for years. She knew how things moved when people trusted one another. Her plan was simple. She offered a paper note that said, "This is a promise. Someone will pay this later." The trick was that the note could be passed on. A baker could take it for flour and then give it to a carpenter. The carpenter could use it to buy cloth. The note could travel through hands and markets before the first person paid it back. It was trust made small and light. At first, the notes felt strange to many. Traders liked coins and things that clinked. But coins stayed where they were heavy. The notes moved. They let people trade even if coins were far away. A stall owner sold spices and frowned when Hannah offered a note. A child tugged his sleeve and pointed at a human toy. He wanted it. The owner took the note because the toy would bring customers later. He tested it by passing it to his neighbor. The neighbor accepted. The note passed again. Word spread like a warm wind. People learned it was easier to buy with a note than to wait for a ship of coins. Small shops used the notes to order parts from other systems. A few traders grew bolder and began to accept notes often. The notes made small trades move fast. That was the plan. But the empire watched. Its merchants liked rules and steady pay. Big merchant houses held the power by controlling credit. They lent and called in favors. When trade changed, their power wobbled. The empire's spymasters watched the market screens. They fed data into high halls. A message went up the chain, uncontrolled liquidity. In the palace that phrase had weight. It meant danger. Hannah did not mean to break an empire. She wanted a better way for small traders to trade. Still, the notes touched a thin place in the market's skin. A merchant house found customers taking notes instead of paying fees. He felt money slipping through his fingers. He could call in debt and force payment. If he did, he would look like a bully. If he did not, he would lose margin and influence. The merchant sent a private word to his guild. The word reached a man in a gray suit who read ledgers for a living. He called his boss and the boss called his boss. That same night, the empire's council met. They did not shout. They had no need. They had law, ships, and power. They needed a reason. The market gave one. Inside the market, Hannah and her partners worked to protect traders who used notes. They opened a small human consulate and guaranteed the first 1,000 notes. That promise calmed worried stall owners. A few traders accepted the guarantee and used the notes boldly. The human relay moved on. Outside the market, officials sent inspectors. They came in neat uniforms and clipped shoes. They asked questions. They checked ledgers and codes. Some stall owners paid fines for small mistakes. Others closed for a day while their accounts were checked. The inspectors were polite but firm. The market felt a change. Hannah watched the inspectors with calm eyes. She had a legal team and a few old bankers who loved clean math. They made contracts and public ledgers. They made it clear, a note that followed the rules was a legal thing in many neutral stations. The inspectors could not seize everything. For a time, the market breathed. Still, the empire moved pieces. It blocked some ports. It raised tariffs on human goods. The moves hurt small traders. Hannah's team opened relay banks on neutral stations and offered emergency credits to suppliers who could not move goods. The small loans kept warehouses full. The notes kept buying. Money moved in quiet, legal steps. The empire tried to push back, and each human step answered with another small, careful step. Tension grew like an animal waiting under a ledge. Merchant houses argued in dark rooms. Some whispered for force. Others feared that a fight would break trade forever. A rich merchant saw his neighbor's customers vanish and his profits shrink. He thought of fleets and guns. He thought of orders and pride. He sent a short, dangerous message to Hannah, "Stop or we call the fleet." Hannah held the message and read it twice. She did not smile. She knew what a fleet could do to a market of floating stalls. But she also knew the empire's power came from law as much as from ships. She had lawyers and ledgers and the slow power of many small trusts. The notes had already moved too far to undo. In the quiet after the warning, the market glowed and hummed. Traders counted notes and prices. People balanced fear and hope. The human trick had not broken the empire yet. It had only broken the habit of control. Someone in the palace would speak and the world would shift. Hannah closed her case and walked to a stall where a child held a little toy. She paid for it with a note and watched the child smile. The market waited. The empire weighed its options. The next move would not be only money. It might be law, or a fleet, or both. Traders kept trading. The small notes passed like a secret, and every pass pulled the market in a new direction. The fleet was not loud. It moved like a patient animal, slow and sure. Word from the market climbed the guild halls and then the palace. The empire could not ignore the human notes. Its merchant houses had kept power by holding credit tight. When value began to flow in new channels, their control loosened. Hannah worked fast. She had traders, a coder named Leela, and an old banker called Baron. Baron loved clean numbers. He smiled when ledgers balanced. He hated surprises. Now he faced a new kind of surprise, value moving without the old hands. They opened relay banks on neutral stations. The relay bank was small and plain. It accepted a human note and issued a token the empire's merchants could use. The token matched the empire's ledgers. To the big houses, it looked safe. But the token could travel where old ledgers could not. It could move trust across borders and bonds without a single heavy coin changing hands. People used the tokens to pay suppliers. Small traders used them to buy grain and parts. A dock worker who once waited months for payment now had a token that paid today. The tokens let trade happen when ships of coins sat stuck behind a customs line. The human trick was simple: make trust easy to move, and people will use it. A rich merchant in a coastal orbit felt it first. His warehouses were full of goods bought on old promises. When customers used tokens, he lost his fees. He called for repayment and called for favors. He thought a few threats and a fleet would fix things. He did not realize how many small trades had already changed hands. The empire's administrators sent auditors to the market. They filled forms and asked for ledgers. The auditors wanted to close the relay banks and arrest people who broke guild rules. Hannah's team had thought ahead. They showed public ledgers and neutral station guarantees. The law in many places said neutral banks could hold funds. The auditors could not seize everything. Still, the palace grew worried. They blocked some ports and raised tariffs on human goods. The move hurt small traders who could not move stock quickly. Warehouses filled with goods nobody could move. Panic began in quiet corners of the market. Hannah's people acted again. Baron opened emergency credit lines to suppliers who could not get ships out. Leela wrote code that let relay banks work with small local ledgers. The lines of credit were short and strict. They were not charity. They were careful promises with clear steps to pay back. The banks moved value where the empire could not cut it off. The first big house to fail did not fall with a shout. It fell with a small scrape of paper. One of its clients could not pay a debt because his buyers used tokens. Another client defaulted. A little chain of missed payments became a crack. The great house could not call in a full set of favors fast enough. Its bonds weakened. Without support, its stock fell. Ships that had carried its name now sat with empty holds. When the house collapsed, neighbors felt the tremor. Some saw danger. Others saw chance. A quiet governor whispered to his friends, "We must keep trade. We cannot let markets freeze." He did not want war. He wanted his tax receipts and grain deliveries. He opened his ports to neutral relays. That move was small but public. It showed merchants they could trade without the house. The palace had an old way to answer this kind of trouble: law or force. Admirals prepared ships. The palace could blockade routes and seize goods. That would stop the tokens and frighten traders back into old hands. But blockades cost money. The houses that supplied fuel and food to the fleet were the same houses now threatened. Many of them refused to help if their debt stayed unpaid. The purse strings of the empire tightened. Inside soft rooms, men argued. Some wanted a show of force. Others said a war would ruin what the palace needed most, the market. A minister who loved stability warned that a blockade could topple other houses and cause a chain reaction. The empire's strength came from many small pieces. Blow one part too hard, and the whole system might wobble. Hannah felt the danger in her throat. She had not wanted ruin. She wanted fair trade for small sellers. But the tokens were working. They moved money in tiny legal steps until big houses found their margins thin. The human trick was not a bomb. It was a slow water that found weak joints. While the palace argued, the market changed. Merchants who feared the palace's wrath moved savings to neutral accounts. Traders in small ports bought tokens and hid value in goods that the palace could not easily cut off. The relay banks became a web. No single naval move could stop it without huge cost. The palace sent secret orders to admirals to prepare a show of force. Ships were to move near key lanes. The order was meant to warn, "Stop the new trading or we will." Admirals read the orders and then read their supply lists. Fuel contracts were in the hands of houses that had lost trust. Without supplies, the show of force would be thin. In a dim office, a senior admiral scratched a line on his margin. He did not want war. He wanted to sail with full crews and good fuel. He delayed the order. His delay had a name in the palace: hesitation. It made the council angrier. But it also bought time. Hannah and Baron used time like a tool. They pushed more contracts into the web of relays. They taught small towns how to accept tokens. They printed simple forms so a market clerk could check a token and be sure it had backing. The human trick became a little harder to call illegal. It became normal in many small places. That night, a merchant house loyal to the palace lost its voice. Ships that once answered its call went silent. The palace's plan to move the fleet remained on paper. The empire's purse strings had frayed. Hannah did not celebrate. She watched the market and felt a low fear systems could break, and people would hurt. But she also felt a quiet hope: the trick had shown a way to change trade without guns. The next move would be the most dangerous. The palace could still try a strong hand, or it could choose to change. If it chose war, lives and markets would burn. If it chose law and councils, the change might be slow but steady. Hannah and her team prepared both paths: more legal shields and more relay banks. They knew the empire liked ritual. The next act might come through a court as much as a cannon. When money shakes, men reach for swords. The empire moved ships toward the trade lanes with the slow, sure step of something that thinks it owns the sky. Orders were crisp. Admirals read bright papers and felt their hands tighten. Merchant houses wanted to frighten markets back into old shapes. The palace wanted a clear act, a blockade, a seizure, a single strong hand to close the gap. Hannah did not have battleships. She had contracts, a thin hat of precedents, and one fearless lawyer named Malik. Malik liked old paper. He liked the smell of ink and the weight of a line written and signed. In rooms where steel shouted, he believed a pen could still hold a man. If he could find the right text, the right clause, the empire's power might be slowed by the very laws it used to rule. They chose an odd weapon, the tribunal. The human traders filed a formal petition that an imperial admiral had moved ships too close to neutral lanes. The admiral laughed when he heard it. He called the humans naive. He expected the court to be a slow thing that ate time but did nothing. He had forgotten that ritual and law were part of the empire's power. The admiral's job depended on obeying some rules. If a clerk could point to a rule, the admiral's sword might be tied to a ribbon. Malik read stacks of old charters in a small room and smiled once he found a hinge. A clause from a treaty signed generations ago said military action near neutral trade must wait for a public decree. The admiral had moved ships without that decree. It was a small thing in ink, but it was real. A small hinge can stop a heavy door. The tribunal met in a chamber full of carved wood and slow light. The admiral came with a face that expected obedience. Malik spoke in dry tones. He showed the treaty. He folded the words into a clear point. The admiral's movement broke procedure. The tribunal clerk listened and read and made notes. Ritual took time. Ritual meant the admiral could be delayed. Outside the palace, ships hovered like waiting birds. Inside, the clerk ruled an injunction: the admiral could not seize neutral traffic until the council met and confirmed a decree. The admiral's wings were clipped by ink. Commanders cursed and paced. The fleet stopped. The market inhaled. Hannah and Malik had bought time. Time let relay banks move more credits out of reach. Time let small houses settle debts and move goods to safe ports. What felt like victory was quiet, no cannon fired, no hull cracked, but a large war fleet breathed slow and useless because its captains answered a clerk's pen. Not everyone liked the court's decision. In dark rooms where velvet met iron, a faction plotted to ignore the tribunal. They whispered of private strikes and secret orders. A small group in the palace wanted a fast show of force to frighten traitors back to old ways. Spies moved like small flies. The human plan suddenly needed more than law, it needed a public shield that would make breaking ritual costly in shame and consequence. So Hannah's people did something bold. They arranged to broadcast the tribunal's process openly. They sent live feeds to market screens, to neutral stations, and into the halls where merchants watched. The empire prized honor as much as it prized gold. To be seen breaking law would be a wound to pride. Public shame could be worse than any battle. The broadcast filled the sky with words and ritual. Citizens watched judges read clauses. Merchants heard testimony. Common people watched soldiers hover and wait. The palace felt heat. An admiral who relied on fear now faced a public that saw him obey a clerk's pen. The idea of moving ships without a proper decree began to taste like hubris. Still, danger slipped at the edges. A secret message leaked. It moved through channels and arrived at a forward command: if court delays, act under emergency. A small squadron readied in the night. Men climbed ladders and strapped harnesses. An officer checked feeds and found the public broadcast. Orders hung in the air like a loaded bell. A single wrong push could ring it. Malik and Hannah heard of the leak and moved fast. They called on allies inside the palace, ministers who feared trade chaos more than pride. They asked them to speak in the public gallery, to show the court's power, to make ignoring the clerk visible as a crime against ritual and economy. Voices rose in the hall. Men who might have backed a secret strike found their names in the morning news if they moved. The cost of a private war rose with each live word. At dawn, a high-ranking admiral still looked at his orders and tasted the metal of command. He could launch and risk being seen as lawless. He could wait and keep his honor. Supply lists lay across his table. Ships needed fuel. Without supply, the fleet's roar would be thin. The merchant houses that once fed fleets now measured ledger lines and thought of ruin. The admiral hesitated. Inside a small provincial port, a different sound rose. A lord who had long watched ledgers and ships saw a chance. He had goods to sell and ports that needed trade. He had also a people who liked bread more than banners. Quietly, he declared neutrality and opened his ports to the human relay banks. It was a small public act, but it was sharp. A lord choosing trade over palace pride was a visible crack. The palace felt that like a cold wind. Governors watched their own ledgers and feared the slow loss of revenue. Some met and whispered, "If one port can move free, others will follow." The admiral's orders still waited. The tribunal had them tied in ink. The broadcast made any secret strike risky and public. The Lord's open ports gave merchants new space to move value and goods out of reach. Hannah stood on a balcony and watched lights on the river of trade. She did not cheer. She felt the weight of small things that break great things. She had used law and public light as tools, not as weapons. The market shifted under her feet. The admiral paced and the palace whispered. The next move would decide if the empire folded by law and bargains or if men would try force and burn the thing they needed. For now, the ships waited, the court had its ink, and a provincial port opened its gates. The human trick trust made light and shared had found a hinge of law and a crack in pride. The slow, strange war of papers and ledgers would not end in a single night. But tonight, the market breathed free, and the sky above the lanes held its quiet, dangerous light. The market had moved like water. Now the water found cracks in stone. Hannah watched from a small office above a crowded quay. Below, traders counted tokens on bright screens. In the palace, men in silks read old ledgers and tried to make the numbers look whole again. The empire still had walls, banners, and fleets. But its money ran through many small hands now. That change made the palace nervous. Small lords felt the change first. Governors who once took orders from the capital looked at their own books. Taxes came in less steady. Harbors that paid for soldiers now needed bread for people. A lean winter would make anger grow. A few governors talked together in quiet rooms. They wanted trade to flow, not fleets to move. One by one, they opened their ports to relay banks and to human tokens. Opening a port was small and public. A governor signed a notice and sent a ship to show the flag. The palace called it betrayal. The papers called it a choice. For the traders on the quay, it was relief. Grain left stores. Shops took notes and tokens again. People ate. The palace answered with words and priests. A loud minister spoke in the city squares about custom and culture. He said foreign tokens would steal old ways and break the bonds that held the empire together. He held up a thick book of rules and read until voices in the crowd grew hot. Banners went up saying, "Protect our way." Some crowds booed. Others listened and feared change. Hannah's people met these loud moves with small ones. They sent envoys with offers, a share in a new route, work building small ships, a loan to fix a broken wharf. They made goods flow into towns that had been quiet. A baker who once waited months for payment now took tokens and sold hot bread. People liked bread more than they liked speeches. The human trick moved value into hands that used it right away. This quiet building of trust made palace men more angry. They planned a show. The admiral would call the fleet and parade it along the trade lanes. The palace thought a march of guns would remind people of power. It would show that the empire could stop anyone who broke old rules. The plan sounded good in a warm room with maps and wine. But the fleet needed what the market provided. Ships drink fuel the way men drink water. The great houses made fuel and supplies. Many of those houses had lost money when merchants used tokens. They hesitated. Some suppliers refused to sell to the fleet unless the palace paid old debts. The palace could not find a new purse fast. Pride clashed with need. A provincial commander watched this with a different thought. He had a coast full of small yards and men who like steady work more than speeches. He had already taken a small loan from a human relay bank to buy ropes and grain for his people. When the palace called for parade, he shook his head. He opened his ports and said, in a public notice, that he would stay neutral and keep trade moving. He put a banner up that read, "Trade lives here." The notice spread like light. Other governors read their ledgers and saw the same problem: no fuel, no fleet. One by one, they chose trade over a show. Some did not speak out. Others signed quiet agreements with Hannah's network. The palace lost small partners faster than it could punish them. Anger in the capital rose. Men who had held power for generations felt the ground slide. They tried threats. They tried law. They tried to shame. They called merchants traitors. They painted the human trick as a lie. But the people who needed bread and a job did not listen to right or wrong when hunger came first. Meanwhile, a secret group of palace hardliners planned another move. They wanted a fast strike, a private show of force to frighten traitors back into old hands. The plan was risky. It would break law and ritual. It would also risk open war. A leak of the plan reached Hannah's people. They moved fast. They published lists, backed by public ledgers, that showed exactly who would profit from a strike. The palace feared public shame. A strike would no longer be a private act, it would show who had put money ahead of the people. Pressure rose from many sides. Craftsmen taught new sailors how to use tokens. Schools taught simple accounting. Markets reopened with small banners that said, "We accept trust." The human networks had turned private credit into public habit. That habit was now a kind of shield. In a hot council room the palace met and argued until late. Some wanted to fight and save pride. Others said war would kill trade and taxes and the empire itself. Finally, the palace found a halfway voice. They would not declare war. Instead they called for a public review of trade laws and tax codes. The word was soft. It sounded like reason. For many that word was a gift. A public review let the palace fold without firing a shot. It let governors save face and keep farms and ships moving. It let merchants sign new rules and be called partners, not traitors. To some in the palace, a review was a small defeat. To others, it was the only sensible choice. Hannah watched the palace announcement on a street screen. She did not cheer. She knew change would be hard. She had seen houses crumble and men lose fortunes. She had seen neighbors who had once called for war now cook for refugees. The review was only a step. It would take years of work and law to change how trade worked. Still, the market breathed easier. Ports reopened. A small bell rang in a quay where a child bought a toy on a token and ran off laughing. The palace mailed notices and ordered new committees. The admiral withdrew ships to anchor. The empire had chosen to bend rather than break. For now. Night came and the city hummed. Hannah walked the quay and saw men sharing a small meal. A guard who had once scowled at her nodded and said, "Good trade." It was a small word. It meant more than any parade. A crack had become a fracture. The empire had folded part of its old shape. But deep inside the palace, hands still worked to keep power. The hard part waited, rewriting old laws without burning what people needed. Hannah felt the weight of that work ahead. She tightened her coat and walked toward the market lights. The next step would not be loud. It would be slow. It would need patience, law, and a very human kind of trust. The palace chose a public way out. It wanted a face-saving end. Hannah saw that as a chance. She and her team wrote a short plan that could be a bridge. It would not humiliate the empire. It would let trade flow again. It would protect small traders and keep big debts from crashing towns. They called it the shared code. It had three clear parts: open relay banks under joint oversight, legal guards for small traders, and a public fund to smooth old debts. The words were simple. The meaning was large. The code said, let people trade easily, and if old houses lose, help them get steady so soldiers and sailors still get fuel and bread. The signing took place on a neutral station. Flags from many ports hung slow in the air. The palace sent a quiet delegation. Some merchants came with stiff faces. Hannah's team sat with open ledgers and clear lines. Malik read clauses aloud. Baron counted numbers until his hand did not shake. Leela held a small chip with code and showed how relay banks would work in practice. The ceremony felt like a careful bargain. Men and women signed and placed seals. Cameras sent the images to many worlds. For some, it was mercy. For others, it was the only sensible step. The palace framed it as a review and renewal. The merchants called it new rules. On the quay and in small shops, people watched and breathed. Not everyone accepted the code. Hard men in the palace muttered that the empire had given in. A few merchant houses refused to take part and tried to block towns from joining the relays. Some ports debated late into nights. There were threats and a small sabotage on a relay terminal. A technician was hurt and a shop's list of tokens was corrupted for a day. The people who resisted used old tricks, bribes, scares, and promises of protection that came with high cost. Hannah's team met each problem with the same small tools they used in the market: law, steady numbers, and help where help mattered. The public fund began to send small payments to grain stores that could not move goods because of blocked ports. The relay banks opened low-cost lines to ferry merchants over short gaps. The mediation councils began to work. They were small groups of judges, traders, and local leaders who could sit and fix a fight without guns. New schools taught simple accounting and how to check a token's backing. A teacher in a port city began classes for market clerks. A retired sailor taught people how to read ship manifests. The public watched and learned. The shared code made trade safer where it mattered most, in the hands of people who used it every day. The palace kept some teeth. Laws were rewritten to stop secret strikes and to punish sabotage. Old houses kept some rights but had to join the new system or face limits. Many chose to join, because trade and food mattered more than pride. A few old merchants lost much and faded. Some found small work in the new ports. The change was not fair for everyone, but it kept towns from starving and ships from standing idle. Little things mattered as much as laws. In one market, an old merchant who once sneered at human notes now tapped a tablet to accept a relay token. He learned slowly and made mistakes, but a child helped him, laughing as numbers flipped on the screen. The merchant smiled a small, honest smile. In a quay, a boy burned a tiny stack of old invoices in a quiet fire. He watched the smoke rise and felt like something heavy had lifted. Hannah did not seek power. She wanted trade to be fair and safe. The shared code gave many people the chance to run their stalls without fear. It gave governors a way to keep taxes and ships without sending fleets to scare markets. It gave the palace a face-saving story to tell its people. The trick had worked not because it was clever, but because it gave people something real: bread, work, and trust. Years passed and the change settled. Relay banks grew into small institutions that the public could check. Mediation councils handled fights that once needed soldiers. Schools taught simple finance the way they taught reading. Ports kept a small store of common parts and a ledger anyone could read. Where once a merchant house could call a fleet, now many hands called for calm and common sense. There were still fights. Old men raged in small rooms. A few groups tried to sell illegal tokens. But the new habit was strong. People who trusted one another locally could trade without waiting for a far house. Markets moved. Ships filled with grain and books and tools. The empire kept its shape but with softer lines. The final scene is a market at dawn. Flags move in a slow breeze. Children sit on a low wall and learn numbers. A teacher shows them how a token works on a small tablet. An old soldier watches and unwraps a simple loaf of bread. A child runs to him and offers a toy she bought with a relay token. He smiles and pats her head. Hannah walks through the market and hears small chatter about prices and work. She stops at a quay and watches a ship leave with teachers, books, and seed. Men in gray suits watch too, not with anger now, but with a small, careful interest. The trick that began with a note in a market had changed many things. The last line is quiet and full. A human trick had made an empire fold, not by fire or sword, but by a slow gift, trust made easy, given and shared. People learned to trade, and with trade, they learned to live together in a new way.